"Sweetheart, you must be lost. Economy's back that way." That was the very first thing Marcus Thompson heard as he stepped into the first-class cabin of Sky Vista Airlines with his wife and 2 kids. No "welcome aboard." No polite smile. Just a smirk from the head flight attendant, Margaret Hayes, as she physically blocked the aisle and looked his teenage daughter up and down like she didn't belong. Ava, only 16, froze mid-step. Her cheeks flushed, not from embarrassment, but from the sting of being judged in front of an entire cabin full of strangers. She clutched her boarding pass tighter, as if the thick cardstock could somehow prove she had the right to be there. Behind her, Danielle Thompson, elegant as ever, laid a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. And next to them stood Marcus, 6'2", broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored navy suit. His face was calm, almost too calm, but his eyes told a different story. What Margaret didn't know, what made this moment so dangerously ironic, was that Marcus Thompson wasn't just a first-class passenger. He wasn't just some wealthy businessman. He was the CEO of Thomson Global Holdings, the brand-new owner of Sky Vista Airlines. And every second that passed, every word that dripped from Margaret's condescending tone, was being silently tallied in his mind. Passengers shifted in their plush leather seats, sensing the tension. Some glanced at their champagne flutes, pretending not to watch. Others leaned in just enough to catch the next line of this unfolding drama. Marcus didn't say a word, not yet. He simply extended his hand toward his daughter and guided her past the woman who had just committed the single biggest mistake of her career. Because what was about to happen on this flight from San Francisco to Tokyo wasn't just about one rude flight attendant. It was about respect, dignity, and what happens when prejudice runs headfirst into power. And trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Marcus Thompson had built his life on discipline, precision, and knowing exactly when to make a move. In the business world, he was a strategist. On the basketball court in his younger days, he was the player who saw the whole game before it even happened. And in his personal life, he was a husband and father first. Every decision, every late night at the office, was for Danielle, Ava, and little Jordan. Danielle Thompson was no stranger to high society herself. A former corporate attorney turned philanthropic powerhouse, she carried herself with a quiet elegance that could silence a room without her ever raising her voice. Her warm brown eyes and poised demeanor told you she was a woman who had seen plenty, and survived more. Ava, 16, was sharp, witty, and stylish. She could take down an entire high school debate team without breaking a sweat, but that didn't mean she was immune to the sting of casual cruelty. She had inherited her father's height, her mother's poise, and a sense of justice that burned hot when she felt wronged. Jordan, just 9 years old, was the family's light. Always curious, always moving, always asking questions about how the world worked. For him, this trip wasn't about corporate deals or brand acquisitions. It was about his first time flying over the Pacific, about the excitement of visiting Tokyo, about the little adventures between takeoff and landing. The setting. First class aboard a Sky Vista Airlines Boeing 787 Dreamliner. The cabin smelled faintly of fresh leather and espresso. The soft LED mood lighting washed the rows in a calm, cool glow. Each seat was a private suite with sliding doors, plush bedding, and a massive touchscreen. The kind of comfort that made a 13-hour flight feel like a luxury hotel stay. Outside, the sun was dipping low over San Francisco International Airport. Through the oversized windows, the Thompson family could see the glint of other aircraft taxiing to the runway. It should have been a perfect start to a long-awaited family trip. But one thing was clear. Margaret Hayes, the senior flight attendant in her crisp navy uniform and practiced smile, had decided from the moment she saw them that they didn't belong here. And that single decision was about to turn a routine flight into a lesson Sky Vista Airlines would never forget. Ava had only stepped a few feet into the first-class cabin when it happened. "Well, sweetheart," came a voice dripping with condescension. "Economy is that way." The words cut through the soft hum of the air filtration system like a sharp knife. Ava froze mid-step, the strap of her designer backpack slipping slightly from her shoulder. She turned to see the source. A woman in her late 40s with perfectly coiffed blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, lips painted in a shade of red that seemed to clash with her pale skin. Her name tag read Margaret Hayes. The senior flight attendant stood blocking the aisle, one manicured hand gesturing vaguely toward the back of the aircraft. For a second, Ava thought maybe she'd misheard. But the smirk on Margaret's face made it clear she hadn't. Danielle's eyes narrowed, but before she could say a word, Marcus stepped up behind his daughter, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. His voice was calm, measured, but carried a weight that made people instinctively straighten their posture. "She's exactly where she's supposed to be," he said evenly. "As are we all." Margaret's smile tightened. She reached for their boarding passes as if expecting to catch them in a mistake. Her eyes scanned the tickets: Suite 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D. First class, no doubt. But instead of apologizing, she merely nodded. "Right this way," she said, her tone flat, stripped of the fake sweetness from moments before. The Thompson family followed her down the aisle, settling into their suites. The space was immaculate: folded blankets, noise-canceling headphones, champagne already chilling in crystal flutes for other passengers. But when Margaret returned to offer pre-departure drinks, she barely looked at Marcus or Danielle. "To drink?" she asked curtly, as if reading from a script she didn't want to perform. "We have orange juice or water." Marcus glanced at the businessman in 1A who had been offered champagne in fine crystal just moments earlier. He looked back at his own empty console, then up at Margaret. "Sparkling water with lime, please," Danielle requested, her voice polite but edged with steel. Margaret returned minutes later with 2 small plastic cups, the kind used in coach, and placed them down without a word. Ava looked at her father, her cheeks flushing. "She gave him real glass," she whispered, nodding toward the man in 1A. Marcus' lips curved into the faintest of knowing smiles. "Some people," he murmured, "build their world on shaky assumptions. Let's not get trapped in their architecture." But deep down, he knew, this wasn't over. It was only the opening move in a game Margaret didn't know she was playing. From the moment the cabin door closed and the engines began to hum, the differences in treatment became impossible to ignore. Margaret moved through the first-class cabin with a practiced grace, her voice warm and animated as she chatted with a white couple in 1C and 1D. She leaned in to show them the dinner menu, pointed out the wine list, and even knelt slightly to be at eye level. Her laugh, light and effortless, drifted through the air. But when she reached the Thompsons, the warmth evaporated. She didn't present the full menu. Instead, she rattled off 2 generic options without looking at them. When Danielle asked about the chef special, Margaret gave a clipped response: "We'll see what's available," before moving on without taking their order. It was subtle, just enough that a casual observer might miss it. But Marcus had built his entire career on noticing patterns other people ignored. He saw the way Margaret's body language shifted, shoulders slightly stiff, eye contact deliberately avoided. He caught the slight curl at the corner of her mouth when she passed by their row, as though she'd just swallowed something bitter. Even Ava, only 17, could feel it. She noticed how Margaret's smile suddenly reappeared when she turned to the passengers behind them. She saw the way the woman's hand lingered on the shoulder of a man in 3A, how she called him "sir," with exaggerated politeness. During the hot towel service, Margaret handed theirs over without the small silver tray, simply dropping the rolled towels onto their armrests. When the drink refills came, the other passengers received them in crystal glasses. The Thompsons got theirs in the same plastic cups from earlier. Danielle caught Marcus's eye. Her expression said it all. This isn't an accident. The quiet indignity stacked up like layers of ice, cold, thin, but impossible to ignore. It wasn't about one slight. It was about the consistent, deliberate withholding of the luxury they had paid for, a slow erosion of dignity meant to remind them they didn't belong here. Marcus remained silent, his posture relaxed but his mind cataloging every detail. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was taking notes, watching the shape of the problem form. Because he knew something Margaret didn't, she wasn't just mistreating a family. She was exposing a fault line in the very system he controlled. And when that fault line gave way, the fallout would be more than she could imagine. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when the first real crack appeared in Margaret's polished facade. Dinner service began with an announcement over the cabin speakers. Passengers were invited to select from a menu featuring Wagyu steak, Atlantic salmon sushi sets, and a vegetarian pasta primavera. The scent of seared beef drifted from the galley, rich and mouth-watering. When Margaret reached the Thompsons' row, she didn't bring menus. She simply stood there, pen poised, and said flatly, "For you, pasta's the only option. We're out of the others." Danielle blinked. Out? Already? Her eyes flicked toward the rows ahead where she'd just seen Margaret confirm steak orders with 2 other passengers. "Yes," Margaret replied, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "Pasta or nothing." Ava's brows knit together. "But I saw you." "Ava," Marcus said softly, placing a hand on his daughter's arm. "It's fine." His voice was calm, but his gaze on Margaret was steady, almost surgical. Margaret moved on without another word. Minutes later, a tray arrived with 2 small portions of pasta primavera in plain white bowls. The vegetables were limp, the sauce thin. Across the aisle, the gentleman in 1A was being served Wagyu steak on fine china. A silver cloche lifted with ceremony by a smiling Margaret. Ava's fork clinked against her plate. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. The breaking point came when Jordan, fidgeting in his seat, reached for his apple juice and accidentally knocked it over. The liquid splashed onto the armrest and dripped toward the aisle. Margaret spun around instantly, her lips curling. "Control your children," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to make the passengers in nearby suites glance up. Jordan froze, his eyes wide. Danielle set down her fork slowly, her movements deliberate. "You will not speak to my son in that tone again," she said, her voice low but razor-sharp. Margaret's smirk returned. Some people just don't know how to behave in first class. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Ava gripped her armrest, Danielle's jaw tightened, and Marcus simply leaned back in his seat, the faintest ghost of a smile playing at his lips. Because he knew the storm was coming, and Margaret had just stepped directly into its path. The moment Margaret walked away from their row, Danielle reached for a napkin, dabbing at the small spill on the armrest. Her movements were calm, precise, but her eyes stayed locked on the aisle where the flight attendant had disappeared. Ava leaned in, her voice low but tight. "She can't talk to us like that, Mom." Danielle offered her daughter a faint, reassuring smile. "She can, and she just did. But we decide what happens next." Marcus set down his glass of sparkling water, the plastic rim clicking softly against the table. He turned slightly in his seat, watching as Margaret returned to check on the passengers 2 rows ahead. Her voice was honey-sweet now, her laugh light and practiced, the very opposite of the clipped tone she'd used with him. When she reached their row again, Marcus didn't look away. "Margaret," he said evenly. She stopped, the slightest hesitation in her step. "Yes." "You've been with Sky Vista how long?" he asked, his tone polite but deliberate. Her chin lifted slightly. 13 years. "That's a long time in one place," Marcus said, nodding. "You've seen the company through quite a few changes." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I has." Marcus smiled faintly, leaning forward just enough for his voice to carry. "I imagine you remember the Atlantic Fleet restructuring, when the in-flight service protocols for premium cabins were rewritten." Her mouth parted slightly. That detail wasn't common knowledge. "I suppose," she said cautiously. "Back then," Marcus continued, "the internal training code for premium guest treatment was called Module 4B. Ring a bell." She blinked, caught between answering and moving on. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, sir." Marcus didn't break eye contact. "I'm just wondering how a professional with 13 years of experience manages to forget her own training so completely." The silence between them was sharp enough to cut. Passengers nearby glanced over, sensing something heavier than a simple service complaint. Margaret straightened her posture, forcing a smile. "If there's something you'd like to request." "There is," Marcus interrupted smoothly. "Respect. And the service my family paid for. Think you can manage that?" Her smile faltered, just for a second. "Of course," she said tightly, before walking away. Danielle glanced at her husband, her lips curving into a knowing smirk. "You're not done yet, are you?" Marcus leaned back, his eyes following Margaret down the aisle. "Not even close." Margaret returned a few minutes later with a tray of desserts for the other passengers. Perfectly plated slices of tiramisu, miniature cheesecakes drizzled with caramel, even a few chocolate-dipped strawberries. When she reached the Thompsons' row, she didn't stop. That was the final straw. Marcus rose slowly from his seat. At 6'2", he towered slightly in the narrow aisle, but it wasn't his height that made people turn their heads. It was the calm, deliberate way he moved, like a man who knew he was in complete control. "Margaret," he called, his tone polite but impossible to ignore. She turned, balancing the dessert tray in one hand. "Yes, sir." "Let's skip the formalities," Marcus said, stepping closer. "Tell me, who's your regional director these days?" "Still Andrew Benton." Her eyes flickered, a flash of surprise crossing her face. "How do you know Andrew?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the galley, then back to her. And I assume the Pacific operations still run under the Service Excellence Initiative? That's SEI 04 for short. Now Margaret's brow furrowed. That was an internal code, something she'd only heard in management briefings. You're not in the industry, are you? She asked slowly, suspicion creeping into her voice. Marcus's smile was faint but sharp. Let's just say I've been paying a lot of attention to Sky Vista lately. Enough to know that your premium guest protocol hasn't been followed from the moment my family stepped on board. Enough to know exactly how many steps you've skipped in Module 4B. And enough to have a conversation about it with people whose names you sign on your paychecks. The tray in Margaret's hands wobbled slightly. Sir, if I've done something to upset you, you've done more than that, Marcus said evenly, his voice still calm. But here's your opportunity to course correct before this becomes a career-ending conversation. Her lips pressed into a thin line. What do you want me to do? Marcus gestured toward his wife and kids. Serve my family what we paid for. Bring the salmon that's on board. Bring the wagyu. And next time you speak to my children, you address them with the same courtesy you show everyone else in this cabin. For the first time that evening, Margaret didn't have a quick answer. She simply nodded, turned toward the galley, and walked away, her pace a little faster than before. Danielle leaned toward her husband, her voice low. She's rattled. Marcus sat back down, the corners of his mouth curling into a slow, knowing smile. Good. We're just getting started. When Margaret returned from the galley, she carried the salmon and wagyu on a polished silver tray. The plates were steaming, perfectly presented, exactly what the Thompsons had ordered in the first place. She set them down without making eye contact. Marcus waited until she straightened, then spoke in a tone that was calm but carried the weight of an order, not a request. From this point forward, he said, you will not be serving my family. Chloe will take over. Margaret blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me. Marcus leaned back slightly, folding his hands. You've made it abundantly clear that you're unable, or unwilling, to provide the service we paid for. So, I'm making the change. Chloe is more than capable. Margaret's cheeks flushed. Sir, I don't take orders from passengers. The faintest smile crossed Marcus's face. You will today. A hush fell over the nearby seats. The couple in 3A stopped mid-bite. Even the businessman in 1A turned slightly, pretending not to listen but hanging on every word. Margaret tried to keep her composure. If you have an issue, you can file a complaint after we land. No, Marcus interrupted, his voice still smooth but edged with steel. This is being addressed now. You will step away from my family's section, and Chloe will continue service. That's not a suggestion. It's a directive. Her eyes narrowed. A directive? From who exactly? Marcus held her gaze for a beat, long enough for her to feel the weight of the silence. From someone whose decisions can directly impact your career. And this conversation is already being mentally documented for the report I'll be filing with your executive leadership team. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. She turned toward the galley, her steps brisk. Moments later, Chloe appeared, her expression nervous but determined. I'll be taking care of you for the rest of the flight, Chloe said softly, placing fresh linen napkins and real crystal glasses on the table. Danielle gave her a warm smile. We appreciate it. Marcus nodded to Chloe, then glanced toward the galley where Margaret had disappeared. The shift in the cabin was immediate. The air felt lighter, the tension eased, but the undercurrent of anticipation remained. Because Marcus knew this wasn't the end. It was the first decisive move in a much larger game, and the next play would bring the captain himself into the aisle. Chloe had barely begun refilling their drinks when Marcus reached into the side compartment of his suite and pulled out his phone, not to call, but to check the flight's internal service directory. He already knew what he was going to do. Chloe, he said quietly, could you let Captain Robert Mills know that Marcus Thompson from Thompson Global Holdings has a code red personnel issue in first class? Her eyes widened slightly. Even without knowing the full weight behind the name, she understood code red was not standard cabin lingo. Yes, sir, she replied, heading briskly toward the cockpit. Margaret, standing stiffly near the galley, caught the exchange. She paled. Within 2 minutes, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Mills himself stepped into the aisle. He was tall, in his late 50s, with a kind of commanding presence that made passengers instinctively fall silent. He walked directly to Marcus's suite. "Mr. Thompson," he greeted, offering a firm handshake. "I was told there's a service concern that needs my immediate attention." Marcus gestured toward his wife and children. "My family boarded this flight with every expectation of being treated with the courtesy Sky Vista claims to stand for. That hasn't happened. From the moment we stepped on board, we've been subjected to deliberate disrespect, service denial, and discriminatory treatment from your senior flight attendant." The captain's eyes flicked toward Margaret, who stood frozen a few rows away. "Is that accurate?" he asked, his voice sharp. "She's exaggerating," Margaret said quickly, her tone defensive. "They've been difficult guests." Danielle leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but clear. "The only thing we've been is patient." Captain Mills took a slow breath, then turned fully to Margaret. "You're relieved from service for the remainder of this flight. Chloe will take over your section. Please move to the crew rest area immediately." The color drained from Margaret's face. "Captain." "That's not a request," he said firmly. "It's an order." Passengers in nearby suites pretended to focus on their meals, but the shift in energy was palpable. The quiet satisfaction on some faces was impossible to miss. Marcus didn't gloat. He simply nodded to the captain. "Thank you for addressing it promptly." "My apologies to you and your family," Captain Mills said. "You have my assurance this will be followed up when we land." As the captain walked back to the cockpit and Margaret disappeared down the aisle toward the crew quarters, Ava leaned toward her father. "She's really gone?" Marcus took a sip of his drink, his eyes steady. "For now. But the real consequences will start when we're back on the ground." Margaret didn't return to the cabin. Not even once. From the moment Captain Mills ordered her to the crew rest area, it was as if she'd vanished from the flight entirely. Chloe moved through the aisle with quiet efficiency, setting down fresh linens, swapping plastic cups for crystal, and refilling drinks with a warmth that felt genuine. But even with the improved service, a certain electricity lingered in the air. The passengers in first class were still processing what they'd just witnessed. A senior flight attendant, in full uniform, removed mid-flight. It wasn't something you saw every day. Marcus didn't make a show of it. He wasn't the type to celebrate someone's downfall in public. But he was also not the type to forget. As the hours passed, the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight portion of the flight. Chloe checked in one last time before the Thompsons settled in to rest. "If you need anything at all," she said softly, "please just press the call button. I'll be right here." "Thank you, Chloe," Danielle replied, her tone warm. "We appreciate your professionalism." Marcus glanced toward the closed curtain that led to the crew quarters. "She'll be thinking about this for the rest of the flight," he murmured. Danielle didn't disagree. "And for a long time after we land." By the time the sun began to rise over the Pacific, the cabin stirred awake. Breakfast service began, and Chloe brought out fresh fruit platters, croissants, and hot coffee for the Thompsons, everything served with care. It wasn't until the plane began its descent into Tokyo that the final act of humbling took place. As the captain's voice announced their approach, a quiet knock came from the galley curtain. Margaret stepped out, no longer in her crisp navy blazer, but in the plain red smock worn by junior crew. Her hair was slightly undone, her expression subdued. She avoided eye contact with Marcus as she passed through the cabin toward the rear of the plane, tasked with helping in the economy section for the remainder of the landing. To anyone else, it might have looked like a simple reassignment. But to Marcus, it was clear, her seniority had been stripped away, and she'd been placed exactly where she thought his family belonged when they boarded. Ava caught the moment too. She leaned toward her father with a small, knowing smile. "Poetic," she whispered. Marcus didn't answer. He just looked out the window as Tokyo's skyline came into view, knowing the real reckoning was still ahead, on the ground, in boardrooms where decisions carried weight far beyond one flight. The moment the wheels touched down at Haneda International Airport, Marcus's mind shifted gears. What happened on the flight was unacceptable, but letting it end there would mean nothing changed. As the first-class passengers disembarked, Captain Mills waited at the jet bridge. He extended his hand to Marcus. "I'd like to apologize again, sir. This will be addressed formally." "I'm counting on it," Marcus replied evenly. From the corner of his eye, he spotted Margaret exiting behind a group of economy passengers, her posture smaller, her gaze fixed on the floor. She disappeared into the terminal without a word. Inside the private arrivals lounge, a man in a tailored gray suit approached quickly. "Mr. Thompson," he said, slightly out of breath. "I'm Daniel Rhodes, CEO of Sky Vista Airlines. I understand there was an incident." "That's putting it lightly," Marcus said. He gestured toward his wife and kids. "My family boarded expecting the level of service you advertise. What they got was deliberate disrespect. You've got a cultural problem on your hands, not just a single bad employee." Rhodes looked uneasy. "I'd like to hear your recommendations." Marcus didn't hesitate. First, Margaret Hayes is removed from any customer-facing role effective immediately. Second, you initiate a full review of premium service protocols and retrain every senior attendant. Third, you launch a diversity and inclusion program that actually has teeth, not a checkbox exercise. Rhodes nodded quickly, scribbling notes. "We can make that happen. And one more thing," Marcus added. "You're going to implement a new initiative. Call it Elevate. It's a mentorship and training program for underrepresented staff to fast-track them into leadership positions. Chloe," he gestured toward the young attendant who had just walked in, "is your first candidate. Promote her to lead attendant on her next flight and get her into management training." Rhodes looked at Chloe, then back to Marcus. "Consider it done." Danielle smiled, placing a hand on Marcus's arm. "Turning a bad night into a better future. That's the way to do it." Marcus glanced toward the runway outside the lounge windows, where another Sky Vista jet was lifting off into the morning sky. "If you want a company to rise," he said, "you start by making sure everyone on board is treated with the dignity they deserve." Rhodes extended his hand again, this time with a firmer grip. "You have my word, Mr. Thompson." For Marcus, that was only the beginning. The policies would change. The culture would shift. And maybe, just maybe, the next family walking into first class wouldn't have to prove they belonged there. The drive from Haneda Airport to the Thompson family's Tokyo hotel was quiet at first. The kids were tired from the long flight, the city lights flickering past the car windows like a slow-moving film reel. Ava finally broke the silence. "Dad, why didn't you just tell her right away who you were? You could have shut her down before any of that happened." Marcus looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror. "Because sometimes, Ava, the lesson is bigger than the moment. If I'd pulled rank immediately, she would have just seen me as another powerful man throwing his weight around. But letting her show her true self? That exposed the real problem. Not just her attitude, her assumptions." Danielle nodded. "And that's the part that needs to change, not just one person's behavior." Jordan, still sleepy, mumbled. "But it wasn't fair." "No," Marcus agreed. "It wasn't. But life's not always fair. The question is, when you're in a position to change something, do you just fix it for yourself, or do you make it better for the people who come after you?" Ava thought about that for a moment. "So, you didn't just want her punished. You wanted the airline to change." "That's right," Marcus said. "If all we do is punish, nothing really improves. But if we use the moment to shift the system, we can make sure the next family, who might not have the same resources or influence, doesn't have to go through it at all." The car rolled to a stop in front of their hotel. The doorman opened the door, and cool night air rushed in. Marcus stepped out first, helping Danielle and the kids onto the sidewalk. Above them, the Tokyo skyline glittered against the dark sky, a reminder of how far they'd traveled and how much more they could do. As they walked toward the entrance, Marcus glanced back toward the street. He knew this was just one small victory in a much larger fight, about respect, dignity, and equality in spaces where they weren't always guaranteed. He wasn't naive. There would be other Margarets, other moments. But there would also be more opportunities to stand firm, to call out injustice, and to leave things better than they were found. And that, Marcus thought as he took Danielle's hand, was a first-class lesson worth passing down.